Somewhere in the world at this very moment, a person is being sold, not a product, not a commodity with a shelf life or an expiration date, a human being, their name, their dreams, their humanity, all reduced to a transaction. This is happening right now in cities you know, in countries you trust, in industries you interact with every day. Human trafficking is not a relic of the past, not a problem confined to failed states or lawless regions. It is a contemporary crime, deeply embedded in the global economy, generating profits that rival the drug trade and arms trafficking combined. Yet it remains largely invisible, hidden behind the veneer of legitimate business, obscured by layers of legal complexity, and enabled by the complicity of governments, corporations, and ordinary people. The United Nations estimates that approximately 27.3 million people are in situations of human trafficking at any given moment. This number is staggering. For context, this is roughly equivalent to the population of Australia or Texas or the entire United Kingdom. These are not people who chose their circumstances. These are people who were coerced, deceived, or forced into situations where their labor is exploited and their freedom is constrained. Some are in sex trafficking, forced into prostitution and pornography. Others are in labor trafficking, forced to work in agriculture, manufacturing, domestic service, construction, or fishing. Still others are in debt bondage, where they are trapped in cycles of debt that they can never repay, forcing them to work indefinitely. The human trafficking industry is worth an estimated $32 billion annually. Some estimates put it much higher. This is not money generated by a single criminal organization or cartel. This is money generated by a complex, distributed network of actors operating across borders, industries, and legal jurisdictions. It is money generated by legitimate businesses that knowingly or unknowingly benefit from trafficking. It is money that flows through banking systems, investment funds, and corporate supply chains. It is money that is largely invisible, hidden in plain sight within the normal functioning of the global economy. To understand human trafficking, we must understand that it is not primarily about individual criminals kidnapping people off the street. That does happen, but it is not the dominant mode. Human trafficking is primarily about economic systems that create conditions where trafficking becomes profitable and sustainable. Trafficking flourishes where there is a large population of desperate people with few economic opportunities, and where there is demand for cheap labor or sexual services. Trafficking is enabled by governments that fail to enforce laws against it, by corporations that demand ever cheaper products and services, and by consumers who want to buy products as cheaply as possible without asking where those products come from or what human suffering went into their production. The question that haunts any examination of human trafficking is, how is this possible? How can millions of people be in slavery in the 21st century? The answer is that modern slavery is not fundamentally different from historical slavery. It is based on the same principle, the extraction of labor from unwilling people for profit. What has changed is the mechanism. Historical slavery was based on ownership. Slavers owned enslaved people as property. Modern slavery is often based on debt, coercion, and deception. A trafficker does not claim to own a trafficked person. Instead, the trafficker claims that the trafficked person owes a debt for transportation, for housing, for food that must be repaid through labor. Since the debt is artificially inflated and the wages are artificially deflated, the debt can never be repaid. The person remains trapped indefinitely. This system is not accidental. It is the product of deliberate economic structures designed to maximize profit by minimizing labor costs. It is the inevitable consequence of a global economic system where corporations compete for market share by reducing costs, where consumers demand lower prices, where governments fail to regulate labor practices, and where the most vulnerable people have no power to resist exploitation. Human trafficking is not a deviation from capitalism. It is capitalism functioning as designed, the extraction of maximum value from human beings. To understand the economics of human trafficking, we must examine the supply side first. Where do trafficking victims come from? They come from places where people have few economic opportunities. They come from countries with high poverty rates, high unemployment rates, and limited access to education. They come from regions experiencing conflict, where economic infrastructure has been destroyed and people are desperate. They come from communities where corruption is endemic and government institutions are weak. They come from situations where they are already marginalized, people with disabilities, LGBTQ+ individuals, indigenous peoples, ethnic minorities, and other groups that face discrimination. Recruiters deliberately target these vulnerable populations. A recruiter might approach a poor young person and offer them a job in a wealthy country, a job that offers much higher wages than are available locally. The job might be real or it might be fabricated. The wages promised might be real or fabricated, but the pitch is always the same: opportunity. For a person living in poverty with no other options, this pitch is irresistible. The person agrees to go. The recruiter arranges transportation. The person is transported to a new country where they are told they now owe a debt for transportation, for housing, for food, for administrative fees. The debt is often inflated. A transportation cost that should be $500 is listed as $5,000. The person is then put to work, but their wages are kept low, their working conditions are poor, and the debt never decreases because new fees are constantly being added. This process is not random. It is part of a sophisticated supply chain. Recruiters identify vulnerable people and deceive them about the nature of the work. Transporters move people across borders. Handlers manage the people once they arrive at their destination. Customers, whether employers, businesses, or individuals, use the labor. Each link in the chain has incentives to participate. Recruiters profit from recruitment commissions. Transporters profit from transportation fees. Handlers profit from the margin between what they pay the trafficked person and what they charge the employer. Employers profit from cheap labor. Customers profit from cheap products and services. This supply chain operates across industries. In agriculture, trafficked people are forced to work on farms, harvesting crops under brutal conditions. In manufacturing, trafficked people work in factories producing goods for export. In domestic service, trafficked people work as servants and nannies. In construction, trafficked people work on building sites. In sex trafficking, trafficked people are forced into prostitution and pornography. In fishing, trafficked people work on boats, often not permitted to leave for months or years. In mining, trafficked people extract minerals under dangerous conditions. In every industry, the pattern is the same. Vulnerable people are recruited, deceived, transported, and then coerced into labor through debt, bondage, physical confinement, confiscation of documents, threats of violence, or actual violence. The economics of trafficking are straightforward. Traffickers profit because they pay trafficked people far below the market wage and charge employers or customers above the market wage. The margin between what they pay and what they charge is pure profit. The key to profitability is maintaining control over the trafficked person. This is why traffickers use debt, bondage, confiscation of documents, threats against family members, and violence. These mechanisms of control are not incidental to trafficking, they are essential to the business model. Without control, trafficked people would escape and the trafficking operation would collapse. For employers, the benefit of hiring trafficked people is obvious: lower labor costs. A factory owner in a developing country might normally pay a worker $5 per day. But if the worker is trafficked, the owner might pay only $2 per day, or might not pay at all, simply providing food and shelter. The owner profits from the labor but does not bear the cost of controlling the trafficked person. The trafficker bears that cost. From the employer's perspective, this is an ideal arrangement: cheap labor without the overhead of having to maintain control. To understand how human trafficking integrates into the global economy, we must examine specific industries where trafficking is endemic. Let us begin with agriculture, one of the largest industries in the world. The global agricultural sector generates roughly $1.3 trillion in value annually. But much of this value is captured by multinational corporations, while agricultural workers, many of whom are trafficked, receive minimal compensation. In India, agricultural workers in the sugarcane industry often work in conditions of debt bondage. Workers are recruited with promises of regular wages. They arrive at plantations and are told they owe a debt for recruitment, transportation, and housing. They are then required to work to repay this debt, but the debt terms are exploitative. Workers are paid far below minimum wage. The cost of housing and food is deducted from their wages. The cost of tools and equipment is deducted. The result is that workers fall further behind in their debt repayment with each passing month. Workers often work 12 to 16 hours per day, 6 or 7 days a week. Many workers are unable to leave because their documents are held by the employer, because they owe debt, or because of threats of violence. The sugarcane harvested by these workers is processed into sugar that is sold globally. American consumers purchase this sugar, or products containing this sugar, without knowing that it was produced through forced labor. The sugar industry knows about these conditions. Human rights organizations have documented trafficking in Indian sugarcane production for decades, yet the industry has not fundamentally changed its practices. Why? Because doing so would increase costs, which would decrease profits, which would make the industry less competitive. As long as consumers demand cheap sugar and are willing to buy it regardless of how it is produced, there is an economic incentive for the industry to continue sourcing sugar from exploitative production systems. The same dynamics exist in many other agricultural sectors. In Thailand, migrant workers from Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia work in fishing, agriculture, and manufacturing, often in conditions of debt bondage. In Brazil, workers are trafficked into agricultural work, including sugarcane harvest and cattle ranching. In sub-Saharan Africa, trafficked workers work in cocoa production, gold mining, and fishing. In Southeast Asia, trafficked workers work in prawn farming. In each case, the pattern is the same. Vulnerable workers are trafficked into exploitative conditions to produce commodities that are exported globally and sold at low prices to consumers in wealthy countries. Now let us examine the garment industry, which is worth roughly $400 billion annually and employs millions of people, many in developing countries. The garment industry is known for low wages, long hours, and poor working conditions. But beyond these general problems, the garment industry also frequently employs trafficked workers. Workers in garment factories in Bangladesh, Vietnam, Cambodia, and India often work in conditions characterized by debt bondage. They are recruited with promises of good wages and working conditions. They arrive at factories and are told they owe a debt for recruitment and housing. They are then worked intensively, often for wages below the minimum wage and sometimes with no pay at all. The structure of the garment industry creates incentives for trafficking. Western clothing brands compete fiercely on price. They demand that manufacturers reduce costs constantly. Manufacturers facing pressure to reduce costs outsource production to subcontractors. Subcontractors facing intense cost pressure look for ways to reduce labor costs. Hiring trafficked workers, who can be paid less than non-trafficked workers, is one way to achieve this reduction. The brands themselves may not directly employ trafficked workers, but the brand's demand for cheaper production creates an incentive structure that leads manufacturers to hire trafficked workers. The global fashion and apparel industry is built on this system. When you buy a cheap t-shirt for $5 or $10, you are participating in a system where labor costs have been minimized to the absolute limit. Some of that minimization is achieved through efficiency. Some is achieved through low wages in developing countries. Some is achieved through exploitative working conditions. And some is achieved through trafficking. The consumer, seeing only the final price tag, has no idea of the human suffering that went into producing the garment. Let us now examine the seafood industry, which generates roughly $150 billion annually and employs millions of workers. Fishing is one of the most dangerous occupations in the world. Fishermen work long hours, often in dangerous conditions, with high injury and fatality rates. But beyond the general dangers of fishing, the fishing industry is also deeply implicated in human trafficking. Workers, many from Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, and other Southeast Asian countries, are trafficked onto fishing vessels. They work for months or years without being permitted to leave the boat. They are paid little or nothing. They work in dangerous conditions with minimal safety equipment. Some are subjected to violence and sexual abuse. The mechanism of trafficking in fishing is distinctive. A worker is recruited, often with false promises. The worker is transported to a port and placed on a fishing vessel. Once at sea, the worker has no way to escape. The worker is told they owe a debt for recruitment, transportation, and maintenance. They are paid minimal wages and the debt is deducted. Because they cannot leave the vessel, they cannot seek other employment or escape their situation. Some vessels stay at sea for years, with workers never permitted to touch land. By the time they return to port, they have earned minimal wages and still owe substantial debt. The seafood produced by these vessels, shrimp, fish, squid, and other products, is sold globally. American consumers purchase shrimp at their grocery store without knowing that it was produced through the forced labor of traffic workers. Thai authorities have repeatedly raided fishing vessels and freed traffic workers. But the problem persists because the economic incentives driving it remain. Consumers demand cheap seafood. Seafood companies compete on price. The pressure to reduce costs creates an incentive to employ trafficked workers. The supply chains in all these industries are deliberately complex and opaque. A piece of clothing might be manufactured by a subcontractor who does not directly employ workers but contracts with another company to produce it. That company might further subcontract to another company. By the time you trace the chain back to the workers, there are so many intermediaries that it is difficult to establish who is responsible for what. This opacity is not accidental, it is deliberate. Corporations structure their supply chains to create plausible deniability. They can claim that they did not know trafficked workers were being employed because they do not directly employ those workers and their subcontractors did not disclose this information. Beyond labor trafficking, sex trafficking represents another major form of human trafficking with distinct economics. The sex trafficking industry generates tens of billions of dollars annually. Women and children, predominantly girls and young women, are trafficked into prostitution and pornography. Some are trafficked across international borders, others are trafficked domestically. Some are trafficked by organized criminal networks, others are trafficked by individual traffickers or informal networks. The sex trafficking industry operates through a different but parallel mechanism to labor trafficking. Women and girls are recruited, typically through deception. They are told they will be hired for legitimate work as models, dancers, domestic servants, or in other occupations. Once they arrive at their destination, they are told they owe a debt for transportation, housing, food, and other expenses. They are then forced into prostitution. Their debt is artificially inflated. Their earnings are kept low. The debt is never forgiven. The women and girls are trapped in cycles of sexual exploitation that can last for years. The customers in sex trafficking are primarily men from wealthy countries or men of wealth in developing countries. These men create demand for commercial sex. They pay traffickers or brothel owners to access trafficked women and girls. In many cases, these customers are not dramatically different from other consumers. They are businessmen, tourists, migrant workers, soldiers. They purchase sex the way they purchase other goods and services. The fundamental economics are the same. A product access to a woman's or girl's body is provided, a price is paid, a transaction occurs. But there is a crucial difference between sex trafficking and other forms of trafficking. Sex trafficking typically involves repeated, ongoing harm to the same individual. A trafficked agricultural worker may be exploited intensively, but experiences a defined form of harm, forced labor. A trafficked sex worker experiences repeated sexual violence, often multiple times per day. This repeated trauma has profound psychological and physical consequences. Many trafficked sex workers develop PTSD, depression, and other mental health conditions. Many experience physical health problems including sexually transmitted infections, reproductive damage, and chronic pain. The demand side of sex trafficking is often overlooked in discussions of trafficking. While much attention focuses on traffickers and victims, less attention focuses on the customers, the men who purchase sex from trafficked women and girls. These customers know or should know that many women and girls in the commercial sex industry are trafficked, yet they purchase sex anyway. This demand drives the supply. If there were no customers willing to pay for sex with trafficked women and girls, traffickers would have no reason to traffic them. The normalization of purchasing sex has increased demand for commercial sex. In some countries, purchasing sex is legal and regulated. In others, it is illegal but widely tolerated. Online platforms have emerged that facilitate the sale of sex, connecting buyers and sellers. These platforms have made purchasing sex easier and more convenient. They have also made it easier for traffickers to advertise their victims. The platforms claim to be neutral intermediaries that facilitate transactions between consenting adults. But in reality, many of the sellers on these platforms are trafficked individuals. The economics of sex trafficking are straightforward from the trafficker's perspective. A woman or girl can be purchased for a relatively small amount, sometimes a few $100s in developing countries. The woman or girl can then be sold for sex multiple times per day, generating revenue of $50 to $500 per transaction depending on the location and the specific services provided. A woman or girl can generate thousands of dollars per month in revenue for the trafficker. The cost to the trafficker is minimal: food, housing, and whatever costs are necessary to maintain control. The result is a highly profitable operation. The markup on human beings in sex trafficking can exceed 1,000%. To understand how human trafficking integrates into the global economy, we must understand the role of governments. Governments are supposed to prevent trafficking and prosecute traffickers. In reality, many governments are complicit in trafficking or enable it through inaction. Some governments actively participate in trafficking. Some are corrupted by traffickers. Some lack the resources or will to prosecute trafficking effectively. Some deliberately enable trafficking because it generates economic value or because powerful people benefit from it. In some cases, government officials are directly involved in trafficking. In Cambodia, Thai and Laotian soldiers and police have been documented participating in sex trafficking. In Mexico, police have been documented participating in human trafficking operations. In post-Soviet countries, government officials have been involved in sex trafficking. In each case, the pattern is the same. Government officials use their authority to facilitate trafficking, either by actively participating or by turning a blind eye in exchange for bribes. In other cases, governments enable trafficking through inaction. A country might have laws against trafficking but fail to enforce them. Government agencies might lack the resources or training to investigate trafficking cases. Prosecutors might decline to prosecute cases because they are difficult or because they involve powerful people. Judges might impose minimal sentences on traffickers because they do not view trafficking as serious. The result is that traffickers face minimal risk of prosecution, which makes trafficking more profitable and more prevalent. In still other cases, governments deliberately enable trafficking because it is economically beneficial. Some countries in Southeast Asia, for instance, have economies that are substantially dependent on sex tourism. Foreign men, primarily from wealthy countries, travel to these countries to purchase sex. Many of these transactions involve trafficked women and girls. The sex tourism industry generates substantial revenue for hotels, restaurants, transportation services, and other businesses. The government benefits from tax revenue and from the economic activity generated. While officially condemning trafficking, governments often lack political will to substantially reduce it because doing so would harm the sex tourism industry. Corruption is endemic to human trafficking. Traffickers must corrupt government officials to operate effectively. A trafficker might bribe a border guard to allow trafficked people to cross borders. A trafficker might bribe police to not raid their facilities. A trafficker might bribe judges to impose minimal sentences. The result is that trafficking networks have deep connections with government officials. These connections insulate traffickers from prosecution and allow them to operate with relative impunity. The role of corruption in trafficking becomes clearer when we examine what happens to traffickers who are prosecuted. In many cases, traffickers who are convicted receive minimal sentences. A trafficker in Thailand might receive a sentence of a few years in prison. A trafficker in India might receive a similar sentence. Sentences are often much lighter than sentences for drug trafficking or arms trafficking. This suggests that governments do not view human trafficking as a serious crime. Alternatively, it suggests that traffickers have political connections that allow them to receive light sentences. The role of corporations in enabling trafficking is also crucial. Large corporations that source products from countries with high trafficking prevalence often have supply chains in which trafficking occurs. Some corporations are unaware of the trafficking, but many corporations are aware or should be aware of it. Corporations have been documented to source from suppliers known to employ trafficked workers, deliberately obscure their supply chains to avoid accountability, lobby governments to weaken labor protections that would make trafficking less profitable, resist transparency requirements that would reveal trafficking in their supply chains, settle lawsuits alleging trafficking in their supply chains with confidentiality agreements that prevent public disclosure. The key insight is that trafficking is profitable for corporations because it reduces labor costs. A corporation could choose to ensure that its supply chain is trafficking-free by paying higher prices to suppliers and conducting rigorous audits. But many corporations choose not to because doing so would reduce profit margins. Instead, corporations maintain plausible deniability. They claim not to know about trafficking in their supply chains while structuring their supply chains in ways that make trafficking likely. The financial side of human trafficking is crucial to understanding how it integrates into the global economy. Trafficking generates tens of billions of dollars annually, and this money must be moved through the financial system. How does this happen? Traffickers typically operate small, cash-based operations. A trafficker might receive payments in cash from employers or customers. The trafficker then needs to move this cash into the formal financial system to store it, accumulate it, and eventually use it. But depositing large amounts of cash into banks raises red flags. Banks are required by law to report suspicious transactions, so traffickers have developed techniques to evade detection. The most common technique is called smurfing, depositing cash in small amounts under the reporting threshold to avoid triggering automated detection systems. A person might deposit $9,000 in cash at one bank, then $8,000 at another bank, then $7,000 at a third bank. None of these deposits individually triggers a reporting requirement, but collectively they move a large amount of money into the banking system. Once the money is in the banking system, it is much easier to move internationally and to obscure its origins. Another technique is to use informal money transfer systems. In many parts of the world, informal money transfer systems, often called hawala or by other names, allow money to be transferred internationally without going through formal banks. A person might give cash to a money changer in Thailand. The money changer contacts a counterpart in the United States. The counterpart gives the equivalent amount to the recipient in the United States. No formal record of the transaction is created, making it difficult for authorities to trace. These informal systems are legal in many jurisdictions and are used for legitimate purposes, but they are also used extensively by traffickers to move money. A third technique is to integrate trafficking profits into legitimate businesses. A trafficker might use trafficking profits to invest in a legitimate business, a restaurant, a hotel, a shop. The business then generates revenue that is mixed with trafficking profits. By the time the money is reported as business income, it is indistinguishable from legitimate business revenue. The business provides a vehicle for money laundering, converting dirty money from trafficking into clean money that appears legitimate. Banks play a crucial role in this process, whether intentionally or not. Some banks deliberately facilitate money laundering in exchange for fees. These banks are willing to ignore suspicious transactions and to facilitate the movement of money derived from human trafficking and other crimes. Other banks simply fail to detect suspicious transactions despite having systems in place to do so. Regulatory agencies are supposed to monitor banks for money laundering, but detection is difficult and penalties are often light. The financial system's involvement in human trafficking is not accidental. By design, the financial system facilitates the movement of money across borders with minimal transparency. Large corporations transfer billions of dollars internationally every day. Wealthy individuals move money through complex financial structures. Government officials move money through private banks. In this context of massive, routine financial flows, the movement of trafficking money is almost invisible. It is a small portion of a much larger volume of international financial flows. Consumer demand drives human trafficking. Consumers in wealthy countries demand cheap products. This demand creates an incentive for corporations to reduce costs. Corporations reduce costs by reducing labor costs. Labor costs are reduced by employing trafficked workers. Consumers, by purchasing cheap products, are funding human trafficking. This is not to say that consumers are morally responsible for trafficking in the way that traffickers are. Consumers are typically unaware of the trafficking in their supply chains. Corporations deliberately conceal this information from consumers, but consumers do have the ability to demand transparency and to avoid products produced through trafficking. Most consumers choose not to make this demand or effort. The economics of consumer demand are straightforward. A consumer purchasing a $5 t-shirt is making a decision that this t-shirt is worth $5 to them. But the actual cost of producing the t-shirt, including fair wages for workers, might be $15 or $20. The difference is typically absorbed by some combination of reduced profit margins for retailers, reduced profit margins for manufacturers, or reduced wages for workers. In highly competitive markets like apparel, the difference is often absorbed through reduced wages. And when wages are reduced below subsistence levels, trafficking becomes an attractive option for employers seeking to reduce costs further. The same dynamics apply to other products. A consumer purchasing cheap shrimp is making a decision that cheap shrimp is worth the price. But cheap shrimp often depends on traffic labor in fishing. A consumer purchasing cheap chocolate is making a decision that cheap chocolate is worth the price. But cheap chocolate often depends on traffic labor in cocoa farming. A consumer purchasing cheap flowers is making a decision that cheap flowers are worth the price. But cheap flowers often depend on traffic labor in flower farming. These are not individual failures by consumers. They are systemic failures in how the economy is structured. The system is designed to hide the true cost of products from consumers. Corporations deliberately structure supply chains to create opacity. Governments fail to require transparency. As a result, consumers have no way to know whether the products they purchase were produced through trafficking. To combat trafficking through consumer choice would require consumers to have transparent information about how products were produced, which workers produced them, and how they were treated. Some corporations provide this information, but many do not. Some certification systems exist that verify products are produced without trafficking, but these systems are incomplete and sometimes unreliable. A consumer who wanted to purchase only products produced without trafficking would find it nearly impossible to do so given the opacity of most supply chains. Let us now examine specific supply chains where trafficking is endemic and understand how trafficking integrates into global commerce. We will start with the garment supply chain, which connects cotton growers in developing countries to textile manufacturers to garment manufacturers to retailers to consumers in wealthy countries. Cotton is grown in countries including India, Uzbekistan, Pakistan, China, and Brazil. In Uzbekistan, cotton is harvested significantly through forced labor. The Uzbek government has repeatedly been documented forcing citizens to pick cotton during harvest season. Workers are forced to leave their jobs and schools to work on cotton farms for little or no pay. This is a form of state-sponsored forced labor. The cotton produced in Uzbekistan is exported globally and incorporated into garments sold worldwide. Consumers purchasing garments produced from Uzbek cotton are indirectly supporting state-sponsored forced labor. In India, cotton farming is associated with debt bondage. Farmers borrow money at high interest rates to purchase seeds, fertilizer, and pesticides. If crop yields are poor or prices fall, farmers cannot repay their loans. Many Indian farmers commit suicide when faced with insurmountable debt. Others are forced into bonded labor. They and their families work for landowners to repay the debt. This debt bondage sometimes extends to agricultural workers hired by farmers. Workers are hired with promises of wages but are told they owe a debt that must be repaid through labor. The debt is structured so that it can never be repaid. The cotton harvested by these workers is exported to textile manufacturing countries, primarily in India, Pakistan, China, and Bangladesh. In textile factories, workers, many of whom are trafficked, work long hours for low wages. In Bangladesh, textile factories have been documented employing trafficked workers. Recruiters travel to poor regions and recruit workers with promises of jobs in textile factories. Workers are transported to factories and told they owe a debt for recruitment and transportation. They are then put to work. Wages are low, working conditions are poor, and the debt is never repaid. The textile produced in these factories is then sold to garment manufacturers. Garment manufacturers in Bangladesh, Vietnam, Cambodia, India, and China produce garments for Western brands. Many of these garment manufacturers employ trafficked workers. In some cases, manufacturers themselves recruit workers. In other cases, manufacturers contract with labor brokers who recruit workers. The labor brokers are incentivized to reduce labor costs, so they are likely to recruit trafficked workers who can be paid less than non-trafficked workers. The garments produced by these workers are then shipped to retailers in wealthy countries. These retailers include discount retailers like Target and Walmart, mid-range retailers like Old Navy and Gap, and luxury retailers like Gucci and Louis Vuitton. The retailers sell these garments to consumers at prices ranging from $10 to $1,000 depending on the brand. Consumers purchase these garments without knowing about the trafficking in their supply chains. This entire supply chain is designed to maximize profit at each stage while minimizing labor costs. Farmers are pressured to reduce production costs. Textile manufacturers are pressured to reduce costs. Garment manufacturers are pressured to reduce costs. Retailers are pressured to reduce costs. Each pressure is transmitted down the supply chain, ultimately resulting in minimal compensation for workers. When compensation is too low to sustain workers, trafficking becomes an attractive option for employers seeking to reduce costs further. Now let us examine another supply chain, seafood. Seafood is caught in fishing vessels, processed in processing plants, packaged, and then shipped to retailers and consumers. Each stage of this supply chain is associated with trafficking. In the fishing stage, workers are often trafficked onto fishing vessels. A worker from Thailand might be recruited with promises of a good wage. The worker is transported to port and placed on a fishing vessel. Once at sea, the worker cannot escape. The worker is told they owe a debt for recruitment, transportation, and food. The worker is paid a minimal wage. The debt is never repaid. The worker works for months or years without being permitted to leave the vessel. The fish caught by these workers is then transported to processing plants, often in Southeast Asia. In processing plants, workers, many of whom are trafficked or migrant workers in exploitative conditions, process the fish. They work long hours for low wages in poor conditions. The processed seafood is then shipped to retailers in wealthy countries. Consumers purchase this seafood at grocery stores without knowing about the trafficking in its supply chain. The role of technology in human trafficking has evolved significantly in recent years. Technology has made trafficking easier and more profitable in some ways and harder to hide in other ways. Online platforms have emerged that facilitate the sale of sexual services. These platforms, which include websites and mobile applications, allow individuals to advertise sexual services and for customers to book appointments. These platforms are sometimes presented as empowering sex workers by allowing them to work independently without relying on pimps or brothels. And indeed, some individuals using these platforms are independent sex workers who have chosen this work and control their own conditions. But these platforms are also extensively used by traffickers to advertise trafficked women and girls. A trafficker might place an advertisement for a woman on an online platform, collect payments from customers, and keep the payments. The woman has no control over her situation and no choice about whether to participate. From the customer's perspective, the transaction appears to be with a consenting sex worker. But in reality, it is a transaction with a trafficked person. The platforms claim to prohibit trafficked women from being advertised on their services, but enforcement is minimal. The platforms rely on users to report trafficking, but many customers either do not recognize trafficking or do not care. The platforms have been slow to implement more aggressive trafficking detection. As a result, trafficking flourishes on these platforms. The internet has also enabled traffickers to identify and recruit victims more easily. A trafficker can advertise job opportunities on social media and through classified advertising websites. A vulnerable person can be recruited with false promises of a job. The entire recruitment process can occur online without the trafficker ever meeting the victim in person until the victim arrives at their destination. The internet has also enabled the distribution of child sexual abuse material. Digital images and videos of children being sexually abused can be produced and distributed globally instantaneously. The production of this material involves real harm to real children. Children are trafficked specifically to produce this material. The material is then distributed through encrypted channels and sold to consumers. The profitability of producing and distributing this material creates an incentive to traffic children. On the other hand, technology has also enabled anti-trafficking efforts. Digital forensics allow investigators to trace online trafficking operations. Artificial intelligence can be used to identify trafficking advertisements. Online platforms can implement more sophisticated detection systems, but these efforts often lag behind traffickers' ability to adapt and evade detection. The global economy creates structural conditions that enable human trafficking. These conditions include global wage inequality. Workers in wealthy countries earn substantially more than workers in poor countries. A garment worker in the United States might earn $15 per hour. A garment worker in Bangladesh might earn 50 cents per hour. This massive wage differential creates incentives for employers to source production from low-wage countries. And within low-wage countries, the pressure to reduce wages further creates incentives to employ trafficked workers. Weak labor protections. In many developing countries, labor laws are weak or not enforced. Workers have minimal legal protections. Collective bargaining is limited. The minimum wage is very low or not enforced. Workplace safety standards are not enforced. In this environment, employers have the freedom to exploit workers, including trafficked workers. Migration restrictions. Workers in poor countries would like to migrate to wealthy countries to earn higher wages. But wealthy countries restrict immigration. This creates a demand for unauthorized migration. Traffickers exploit this demand by offering to facilitate unauthorized migration, then exploiting migrants once they arrive. Corruption. Government officials are often corrupted by traffickers. This corruption makes it difficult to prosecute trafficking and enables traffickers to operate with relative impunity. Lack of transparency. Supply chains are deliberately opaque. This makes it difficult for consumers, governments, and civil society organizations to detect and prevent trafficking. Power imbalances. Traffickers have power over victims through debt, confiscation of documents, violence, and threats. This power imbalance allows trafficking to persist even when victims have opportunities to escape. Demand. Consumers demand cheap products. Employers demand cheap labor. Customers demand cheap sexual services. this demand creates incentives for trafficking. What can be done to address human trafficking? Potential solutions include strengthened law enforcement. Governments could dedicate more resources to investigating and prosecuting human trafficking. This would require training law enforcement officers in trafficking investigation, providing resources for investigations, and ensuring that prosecutors prioritize trafficking cases. It would also require establishing trafficking as a serious crime with substantial penalties. Regulation of corporations. Governments could require corporations to audit their supply chains for trafficking and to disclose what they find. Governments could impose penalties on corporations that employ trafficked workers. This would create financial incentives for corporations to avoid trafficking in their supply chains. Transparency requirements. Governments could require transparency about supply chains. Consumers could then make informed choices about which products to purchase. Transparency requirements would also make it easier for governments and civil society to detect trafficking. Labor protections. Governments could strengthen labor laws and enforce them effectively. This would increase the cost of employing non-trafficked workers, making trafficking less profitable by comparison. Reduced wage inequality. If wages in developing countries were closer to wages in wealthy countries, employers would have less incentive to shift production to low-wage countries and then exploit workers further through trafficking. This could be accomplished through international agreements on minimum wages, through collective bargaining, or through trade policies that link trade benefits to labor standards. Reduced migration restrictions. If workers could migrate more easily to wealthy countries, they would have less need to rely on traffickers to facilitate migration. Reducing trafficking opportunities would reduce trafficking prevalence. Demand reduction. Consumers could choose to purchase only products certified to be produced without trafficking. Customers could choose not to purchase commercial sex. This would reduce demand for trafficked labor. Victim support. Governments and civil society could provide substantial support to trafficking survivors. This would include safe housing, medical care, psychological counseling, job training, and legal support. It would also include allowing survivors to remain in countries where they are safer, rather than forcing them to return to their home countries where they might face re-trafficking or violence. But each of these solutions faces obstacles. Strengthening law enforcement requires government will and resources that many governments lack or choose not to provide. Regulating corporations requires governments to prioritize labor standards over corporate profits and economic growth, which many governments are reluctant to do. Transparency requirements face corporate opposition. Labor protections face corporate opposition. Reducing wage inequality would require wealthy countries to accept lower growth or less profit for corporations, which many wealthy countries and corporations are reluctant to do. Reducing migration restrictions faces political opposition in wealthy countries. Demand reduction requires consumers to care about trafficking and to be willing to pay more for products, which most consumers are unwilling to do. The fundamental issue is that human trafficking is embedded in the structure of the global economy. Ending trafficking would require fundamental changes to how the global economy operates. It would require reducing inequality, strengthening labor protections, increasing transparency, and prioritizing human welfare over corporate profits. These are not impossible changes, but they face enormous political obstacles from those who benefit from the current system. To understand the true scale of human trafficking and its integration into the global economy, we must recognize that the numbers we cite are almost certainly underestimates. The 27.3 million people estimated to be in human trafficking at any given time is based on extrapolations from surveys and known cases. The actual number is almost certainly higher. Many cases of trafficking are never detected. Many victims never come forward. Many victims are unaware they are being trafficked. Similarly, the $32 billion estimate of annual trafficking profits is almost certainly an underestimate. This figure is derived from extrapolations and partial data. The actual figure could be much higher. Some estimates place trafficking profits in the hundreds of billions of dollars when including the value of exploited labor, not just direct trafficking profits. The point is that human trafficking is not a marginal problem. It is not a fringe crime perpetrated by a small number of criminals. It is a systemic problem embedded in the global economy, involving millions of people and hundreds of billions of dollars. It involves legitimate corporations, government officials, financial institutions, and ordinary consumers. It is a crime so deeply embedded in the structure of the global economy that most people are unable to see it, even when they are participating in it. To recognize this requires a shift in perspective. Most people think of trafficking as something that happens to other people in other places. Most people think of trafficking as a problem perpetrated by obvious criminals, gangsters, and pimps. Most people think of trafficking as something that governments are fighting against. None of these perspectives is wrong, but all are incomplete. Trafficking happens to vulnerable people everywhere, including in wealthy countries. Trafficking is perpetrated not just by obvious criminals but by corporations, government officials, and ordinary business people. Governments are sometimes fighting trafficking, but many governments are complicit or enable it. The commodities we consume daily, the clothes we wear, the food we eat, the seafood we purchase, the flowers we buy often depend on trafficking. Not always, but often. We know this is true or we should know it, yet we continue purchasing these commodities. We do this because we are not forced to confront the trafficking. The supply chains are opaque. The exploitation is invisible. We can purchase these commodities while maintaining the fiction that no one was harmed in their production. The economics of human trafficking are ultimately rooted in the economics of the global capitalist system. The system is designed to maximize profit and minimize costs. When labor is the costliest input and can be substantially reduced through trafficking, the system creates incentives for trafficking. These incentives are structural, not individual. Individual traffickers are criminals, but the system that creates opportunities for trafficking is legal and normal. Ending trafficking would require changing the structure of the global economy, not just catching and punishing individual traffickers. This is an uncomfortable truth. It suggests that trafficking is not an aberration but a feature of the current economic system. It suggests that all of us, as consumers, as workers, as citizens, are implicated in trafficking to some degree. It suggests that ending trafficking would require changes that would affect us all, including changes to the prices we pay for products and the wages we earn. Yet despite these uncomfortable truths, change is possible. Consumers can demand transparency and refuse to purchase products produced through trafficking. Corporations can restructure their supply chains to ensure trafficking does not occur. Governments can strengthen labor protections and prosecute traffickers effectively. Workers can organize and demand better wages and conditions. These changes are difficult and require coordinated action, but they are not impossible. The first step is recognizing that trafficking is not an aberration but a structural problem embedded in how the global economy currently operates. The second step is deciding that this is unacceptable and that we are willing to make the changes necessary to address it. SOURCES and references. Aki R. Beatty A.S. and Furrer A.M. 2014, Transnational Trafficking, Law Enforcement and Victim Protection, A Middleman Approach. Journal of Law and Economics, 57 349 386. Allain J. and Belser P. 2011, Forced Labor and Human Trafficking, Estimating the Costs and Achievement of Targets. International Labor Review 153-4, 549-569. Bales K. 2012, Disposable People, New Slavery in the Global Economy, University of California Press. Bales K. and Sudalter R. 2009, The Slave Next Door, Human Trafficking and Slavery in America Today, University of California Press. Belser P. DeCock M. and Marin F. 2005, ILO Minimum Estimate of Forced Labor in the World. International Labor Organization Report. Bouch V. and Fromentin V. 2019, Do Markets Facilitate Human Trafficking? Journal of Development Economics, 142, 102,407. Cho S.Y. Dreher A. and Neumeyer E. 2014, Determinants of Anti-Migration Policy, A Global Empirical Analysis. Journal of Development Economics, 107, 7291. Cho S.Y. Dreher A. and Neumeyer E. 2013, Is Freedom of the Press Hindering Human Trafficking? World Development, 63, 1540. Cockbain E. and Braley H. 2020, Gangs and Gun Crime, A Problem-Oriented Policing Approach. Policing, A Journal of Policy and Practice, 14-1, 4456. Kajikaru S. 2015, Are remittances a substitute or complement to taxation? The impact of remittances on government size in the developing world. World Development 74 238-59. Collingwood, P. and William Zelig, S. 2014. Government Procurement and Modern Slavery, A Systematic Literature Review. Supply Chain Management 19-2, 211-25. Seawickle, J. 2016. Understanding Human Trafficking, Data and Research in Gender, Labor and Sex Exploitation. Springer Publishing Company. Danilova Trainer, G. and Belser, P. 2006. Globalization and the Illicit Market for Human Beings. International Labor Review 145 3-4, 225-62. Davidson, J. O. 2015. Modern Slavery, The Margins of Freedom, Palgrave Macmillan. Dottridge, M. 2007. Action on Child Labor and Related Abuse in the Informal Sector, International Labor Organization. Dunn, L. L. 2013. Why Human Trafficking is More Than Just a Crime. Georgetown Journal of International Affairs 14-2, 85-94. Esteves, T. 2016. Trafficking and Exploitation of Migrants, A Multi-Country Study. International Migration 54-4, 79-102. Feigenbaum, A. 2016. Branded Radical: How Sex Work Became a Commodity in Late Capitalism. Jacobin Magazine 22 45-58. Feigenberg, B. 2015. The Economic Case for Investing in Child Care Subsidies. Journal of Human Resources 51, 26-53. Gallagher, A. T. 2010. The International Law of Human Trafficking. Cambridge University Press. Good, C. 2010. Slavery, Dehumanization and Social Contract Theory. Social Theory and Practice 36, 3, 364-388. Grucock, M. 2009. Border Crimes, Australia's War on Illicit Migrants. Institute of Criminology Press. Hepburn, S. and Simon, R. J. 2010. Hidden Homeless, Children with Nowhere to Go, Rowman and Littlefield Publishers. Hughes, D. M. 2002. The Natasha Trade, The Transnational Shadow Market of Trafficking in Women. Journal of International Affairs 53, 2, 625-651. International Labor Organization. 2017. Global Estimates of Modern Slavery, Forced Labor and Forced Marriage, ILO Publications. International Labor Organization. 2021. Global Estimates of Modern Slavery, Forced Labor and Forced Marriage, Updated Report. IOM, International Organization for Migration. 2014. Global Human Trafficking, Emerging Challenges for a New Decade, IOM Migration Research Series. Cara, S. 2009. Sex Trafficking, Inside the Business of Modern Slavery, Columbia University Press. Cara, S. 2012. Bonded Labor, Tackling the System of Slavery in South Asia, Columbia University Press. Cara, S. 2014. Modern Slavery in the Supply Chain of Global Corporations, Ethical Trading Initiative Report. Kelly, L. 2005. You Can Find Anything You Want, A Critical Reflection on Research on Trafficking in Persons Within and into Europe. International Migration 43, 1, 235-65. Kempadu, K. Sanghara, J. and Patnaik, B. eds. 2005. Trafficking and Prostitution Reconsidered, New Perspectives on Migration, Sex Work and Human Rights. Paradigm Publishers. Laxko, F. and Graemgna, M. A. 2003. Developing Better Indicators of Human Trafficking. The Brown Journal of World Affairs 10, 1, 179-194. Lebovitz, A. A. and Posner, E. A. 2010. Coercive Labor, Labor's Role in Economic Development. Journal of Development Economics 93, 2, 212-28. Limonowska, B. 2005. Trafficking in Human Beings in Southeastern Europe, UNICEF report. Marks P.C. and Borba J. 2017, Modern Slavery in Global Supply Chains. Journal of Cleaner Production 150 4759. McSherry B. and Frade J. 2016, Institutional Betrayal. American Psychologist 71 5 330 3344. Miller A.M. 2000, Sexual but Not Reproductive, Exploring the Junction and Disjunction of Sexual and Reproductive Rights. Health and Human Rights 4-2, 68109. Musto J. 2016, Control and Protect, Collaboration, Carcerality and Rescue in the Policing of Human Trafficking, University of California Press. Niepels M. and Roscoe P. 2013, Remaking the World, Myth, Mining and Ritual Change Among the Duna of Papua New Guinea, Smithsonian Institution Press. Natten B. and Tierney M. 2012, Do No Harm, How to Support Child Survivors of Trafficking While Keeping Them Out of the Criminal Justice System, International Program on the Elimination of Child Labor. O'Connell J. 2002, The Use of DNA in Trafficking and Criminal Investigations. Forensic Science International 129-3, 160-3175. O'Neill Richard A. 2000, International Trafficking in Women to the United States, A Contemporary Manifestation of Slavery and Organized Crime, U.S. Department of State Report. Ud D. 2004, I Am Not a Slave, Defining and Proving Modern Slavery in Britain Today, Anti-Slavery International. O'Shea, H. and Gormley, M. 2013, An Evaluation of the Effectiveness of Awareness-Raising Campaigns and Psychometric Scales in Identifying Vulnerable Persons and Reducing Incidents of Human Trafficking. Psychological Reports, 112-3, 680-9706. Pearson E. 2002, Human Traffic, Human Rights, Redefining Victim Protection, Anti-Slavery International. Piotrovich R. 2017, Internally Displaced Persons as a Vulnerable Group in the Context of Human Rights Law, Oxford University Press. Podaki Tripodi M. 2002, Best Practices for Social Work with Refugees and Immigrants, Columbia University Press. Powdell P. 2005, Gender-Based Violence and Trafficking, a Report from Nepal, INSEC Informal Sector Service Center publication. Raymond J. G. and Hughes D. M. 2001, Sex Trafficking of Women in the United States, International and Domestic Trends, Coalition Against Trafficking in Women Report. Reese M. 2010, Alternative Approaches to Addressing Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery, University of Pennsylvania Journal of International Law 31-4, 1140-11184. Renneman L.D. 2013, Migrant Prostitution and Trafficking in Debt in Greece, Anti-Slavery International Research. Ridley J. and Wager N. 2012, Identifying and Responding to Risk Among Victims of Sex and Labor Trafficking, Modern Slavery Research Collaboration. Racha C. 2007, Food Insecurity as a Health Pandemic, Addressing Chronic Hunger in America, Journal of Healthcare for the Poor and Underserved, 18-2, 465-472. Rosario S. 2012, Intergenerational Trauma and Human Rights Violations, A Bangladeshi Perspective, Journal of Refugee Studies 25-4, 540-6565. Siddharth P. 2010, Human Trafficking and Child Labor in India, Causes, Status and Effects, Indian Journal of Social Work 71-3, 387-404. Siddiqui D. M. 2003, The Sexual Abuse and Exploitation of Children and Adolescents in South Asia, South Asia, Journal of South Asian Studies 26-1, 3348. Silverman, J. G. Decker, M. R. Nemoto, T. Ryberg, R. Wachter, K. and Collier Tennyson, S. 2012. Sex Trafficking and the Exploitation of Adolescents. Journal of Adolescent Health 51-12. Skrivenkova, K. 2010. Between Decent Work and Forced Labor, Examining the Continuum of Exploitation in the Philippines. Anti-Slavery International. Surtees, R. 2008. Traffickers and Trafficking in Southern and Eastern Europe, Considering Root Causes and Actors. European Commission Security and Safeguarding Project Report. Surtees, R. 2012. Traffickers and Trafficking in Southern and Eastern Europe, Considering Root Causes and Actors. UNODC publication. Tall, A. 2012. The Challenge of Building Cooperation in Anti-Trafficking Work. Social Policy and Administration 46-4, 453-472. Thachuk, K. 2006. Transnational Threats, Smuggling and Trafficking in Arms, Drugs and Human Beings. Westport, Prager Security International. Thielemann, E. R. and Elenani, N. 2010. Irregular Migration and Human Rights, Obligations and Practice of European States. European Journal of Migration and Law 12-3, 318-336. Thomas, D.Q. 1997. The Health of Women in Detention in Latin America. Women's Rights Law Reporter 19, 377-395. Tirado Lopez, A. 2014. Land and Territory in the Context of Indigenous Peoples' Rights. Journal of International Relations 42-3, 87-1-4. Torga, A. 2006. The Economic Costs of Human Trafficking in Europe, A Quantitative and Qualitative Assessment. Save the Children EU Group Report. Travis, J. 2005. But They All Come Back, Facing the Challenges of Prisoner Reentry. The Urban Institute Press. U.S. Department of State, 2021, Trafficking in Persons Report, Annual Report. UNODC, United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, 2018, Global Report on Trafficking in Persons, UNODC publication. UNODC, 2020, Transnational Organized Crime, A Growing Threat to Public Safety, Peace and Development, UNODC World Report. UNODC, 2021, Global Report on Trafficking in Persons Booklet 2, Trafficking in Children, UNODC publication. Verité Research, 2014, Forced Labor in High-Risk Global Supply Chains, A Rights-Based Approach, Corporate Social Responsibility Initiative Report. Verité, 2015, Debt Bondage in Supply Chains, The Role of Purchasing Practices and Remediation, Research Report. Waller, M.R. 2020, Migration, Human Trafficking and Public Health, International Journal of Migration Research 5-2, 89107. Wheaton, E. M. Shax, E. J. and Gohul, T. P. 2010, Sex Trafficking of Children in the United States, A Market Analysis. Journal of Child and Youth Protection 1-1-101-28. Worktai, 2014, Labor Trafficking in Thai Supply Chains, Agricultural and Fisheries Sectors, Worktai Research Foundation Report. Yun, A. and Secardi, M. 2010, Labor Trafficking Among Migrant Workers in the United States, National Human Trafficking Hotline Data Report.